Good afternoon. Well, you didn't say good afternoon back, but you got quiet, so that's almost as good. Welcome. My name is Matthew Phillips. I'm the director of the BB&T Center for the Study of Capitalism, and it's our honor to welcome today's guest to talk about the way that we help new societies structure their own laws and systems of law and the way that we relate to each other after that happens. So I can't imagine many more appropriate topics for us today. Fernando Tesón is a native of Buenos Aires. He's the Tobias Simon Eminent Scholar at Florida State University School of Law. He's known for his scholarship relating political philosophy to international law, in particular his defense of humanitarian intervention, political rhetoric, and global justice. He's authored Justice at a Distance, Expanding Freedom Globally, Rational Choice and Democratic Deliberation, Humanitarian Intervention, An Inquiry into Law and Morality, A Philosophy of International Law, and dozens of articles in law, philosophy, and international relations journals and collections of essays. Before joining Florida State in 2003, he taught for 17 years at Arizona State University. He served as visiting professor at Cornell Law School, Indiana University School of Law, the University of California Hastings College of Law, the Oxford George Washington International Human Rights Program, and Universidad Torcuato del Tella, Buenos Aires, Argentina. He has dual U.S. and Argentine citizenship, so hopefully he exercised his U.S. citizenship by absentee today, because I know he's been traveling all day to get here. And I hope that you will join me in welcoming him to be with us on this special day and for what I'm sure will be a great program. Welcome, Fernando. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank you very much, Dr. Phillips, Dr. Otteson, for inviting me, for the Center of the Study of Capitalism for inviting me today. I'm very pleased and honored to be talking to you today about my ideas on global justice. In fact, they're not only my ideas, they're also, I have a co-author, that's Lauren Lomaski of the University of Virginia. We both wrote the book together, were many years in the making. And just to tell you a little bit of an inside story, the first publisher we submitted to, the referee said, Lomaski and Tesón must be stopped. This cannot be published. So we took it to another publisher, and luckily the second publisher decided to publish it last year. Okay, so to go to the core of what I want to say today. This is an interdisciplinary book. I am not an economist. I'm a legal scholar and a self-appointed philosopher. I do philosophy, political philosophy, mostly. That's what I do. 99% of my writing is philosophical. And Lauren Lomaski is also a philosopher. But we try to be economically literate philosophers. So we actually self-taught ourselves economics in order to, well, before writing this book, because we think that it's extremely important for anyone who does any kind of social philosophy to understand how the world works. And that means understanding how market works. It is, in my view, irresponsible today to write on global justice, which is the general area that I'm going to cover, without knowing how markets work, right? Understanding the law of comparative advantages, without understanding international labor markets, international financial markets, and so on. So let's start first a little story to situate the problem. So from political philosophy standpoint, the great jumping like 400 years. In the 20th century, the most distinguished political philosopher was John Rawls out of Harvard University, who in 1971 published a seminal book called The Theory of Justice, right? The Theory of Justice was a book that became the referent. Whatever you want to do in political philosophy, you have to be for or against Rawls, or criticize him, or write some footnotes on Rawls or something. That Rawls, I'm abbreviating a lot, gives an extended argument where he suggests that for domestic societies, it's very important, like the United States, for example, two principles of justice are the ones that he recommends. One is equal liberty principle, similar to the freedoms we have in the Constitution, for example, in the United States, or in our European democracies as well. And the second one, which is the one that garnered the most attention, that attracted the most attention, is called the difference principle. Basically, the idea is a principle of redistribution. I am, again, being a little bit inaccurate, but the idea is that social and economic inequalities must be to the greatest benefits of the poor, of the least advantaged members in society. So institutions must be arranged of all the possible institutional options that the designers have so that the poor found themselves in the best possible position. I spare you the argument for this. It's a very complicated, sophisticated argument for this. The idea then that I want you to retain here is that Rawls thought that the principle of justice for the United States or for Australia, for Argentina, for the national societies, is a principle, in addition to the liberty principles that we all know, a principle of redistribution of wealth. Rawls himself favored, this is important for us, vast transfers of wealth through welfare agencies and the welfare state and so forth. He thought that this was required by justice. But what happened? This is what happened. It's fascinating. About 20 years ago, 15 to 20 years ago, political philosophy, which had been centered since Locke, since Plato, had been centered in justice for the state, the national state, people started to worry about global justice. So what are the principles of justice that apply to the world? Because the world, why would principles of political justice or social justice would be valid only for societies, right? And so what happened was something quite amusing, and that is that a bunch of Rawls disciples, the Rawlsians I call them here, right? The Rawlsians, for example, Thomas Pogge and other people, very brilliant, Peter de Marneffe, other very brilliant young philosophers who had studied, most of them with Rawls, right? They decided, no, we need to care about the poor in the world. It's not enough to have principles of justice for the United States only. We need principles of justice for the world. And since they are all Rawlsians, they decided to extend Rawls's principles to the whole world. They had a little problem, though. There was one important Rawlsian that disagreed, and that was John Rawls himself. Right? So he actually said, and the quote is there, he said, globally, we don't owe the poor redistribution of wealth. We owe them simply non-interference, he said. It's more complicated than that. It's not interfering with the project and so forth, not redistribution. And I quote now, why is that? He said, the problem of poor countries is commonly the nature of the public political culture and the religious and philosophical traditions that underlie its institutions. The great social evils in poor societies are likely to be oppressive governments and corrupt elites. Now, the poor Rawlsian disciples were devastated. They said they cannot carry out this project. They wrote books saying we disagree with Rawls. It's awful. I'm pained to disagree with the master, but that's what happened. To make things worse for the Rawlsians, prominent philosopher Thomas Nagel also joined Rawls, and he said that justice applies only in domestic societies and not across borders. Now, I want you to understand what is the problem. Why does Rawls refuse to extend his redistributive principles to the world? I think it's very clear, is that a redistributive scheme for the world is incompatible with a national redistributive scheme, he thought. So that, for example, let me just give you a grotesque example. Suppose that the principles that we ought to care for the poor of the world, and that's the principle, and not for the poor in the United States, then let's take all the Social Security, whatever is left, if there is anything left in Social Security money, and let's start transferring not to me, who am about to retire, right? A kind of a wealthy American to get Social Security payments, but let's give them to the poor in Tanzania, right? So no Social Security, no welfare payments, no unemployment insurance, all those kinds of welfare, no food stamps, all those if you extend them, should go to people in Uganda or Bolivia, and not to some middle class or families in Ohio, right? So this is oversimplifying the problem, but that's what he saw. This is going to be impossible to maintain what I think, attempted in my book, which is a system of justice for a Western advanced constitutional democracy. That cannot, if that's what my theory was for, that cannot withstand being extended to the whole world. We, Lomaski and Tesón, that's us, take the position here that our starting point, it's implausible that there could be a global agreement to share each other's fate. Rather, our mutual obligations largely depend on closeness. I'll come back to this in a moment. So that is just a brief introduction to tell you, to situate the debate. The debate is on global justices. What are the principles of global justice? So the Rawlsians finally, today, 2016, are carrying the day. If you read the mainstream global justice literature, what they would like to see is, with important differences among them, we would like to see a gigantic welfare agency, like a global tax of transfers of wealth from the rich countries to the poor, and so on and so forth. That's their recommendation. We, in this book, dissent. And we think that, for reasons that I'm going to show in a second, that the principle should be exactly the one Rawls said for the world, and that is the principle of non-interference. But let me start from the beginning, make the argument. The argument starts with something that is very familiar to economists, and something that is very important for our project and research that we rely upon, and that is development economics, right? What are the causes of growth and poverty? That's not a small question, right? And one thing that we start in our book is to say that poverty is not like something that just happens to people. It's not like a tsunami or an earthquake. Of course, tsunamis and earthquakes can cause tremendous stress and harm, but that's not the normal case. But people are poor not because of occurrences of nature, but because of the actions of omissions of other human beings, right? So our thesis is that the poor are somehow wronged in some way, right? The mainstream literature, the one that we argue against, says that the poor are wronged by rich countries. That the people in Africa and elsewhere are poor because rich countries have done bad things to them, whether it's colonialism or whether what's presently having structures of domination or whatnot. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Those are the reasons. That's why we need to transfer wealth from the rich countries to the poor, because they are the ones we should place at their feet the blame for poverty, more or less. There are important differences among them again. But our position is that that's not true. That is a misdiagnosis. We believe that the main source of poverty and oppression and other ills lies in bad local institutions, bad rulers. Whether they're evil or not, evil is a very charged word. Maybe they're misguided, but certainly misguided, mistaken rulers and bad institutions, right? And we rely, right, on a very important literature, robust, we think, that supports this. Like, for example, Deirdre McCloskey in a recent book, she talks about the Great Transformation, the Great Enrichment. I'll talk about that in a moment. Why did it happen? How do we answer that? So there are all kinds of answers. The answer that the mainstream literature has is, well, the main enrichment happened because of the predatory behavior by rich countries. And we think that's mistaken. Deirdre McCloskey, we're going to see a variation of the idea that we support. But let's say there are several possible explanations. One is institutionalism, with the one we favor. But there are others, some of them closer to our thesis than others. I'll go briefly through them. So institutionalism is the theory according to which rich countries became rich because they developed better institutions. Simple as that. What are good institutions? in no particular order of importance. This is because it's a big debate about the relative weight of these. So I'm going to be neutral about that here. But they are the rule of law. What is the rule of law? The rule of law is simply that we are subject, people should be subject to rules and not to the discretion of those who are in power. Right? The rule of law is an old idea, an important idea, that we can expect how others are going to behave because they're going to behave according to rules. Political freedoms, including governments who rotate periodically, it is no small part of America's, I think, success in the world, the fact that it's the most stable democracy. Well, today you might be maybe some doubts about some of these things, but in fact, it is an example of unbroken, peaceful transition of power. I think that we all should be proud of that. And then the economic freedoms. That includes, there's again debate about things, and my economics colleagues might have their views on that. But at least we can talk about well-defined property rights. People need to have property rights and freedom of contract, which is a consequence of having property rights, right? So the idea, notice that I say well-defined. It doesn't mean absolute. It means well-defined. But they also have to be broad enough. They have to be robust enough. So I should put there robust and well-defined. Those two things go together, right? Freedom of contract. And also, everybody cites low corruption. Now, it is one of the mistakes, I think, of the mainstream global justice literature. They forget about the economic freedoms. They cite everything else. Oh, of course, Uganda is doing badly because of low corruption. And they say, well, okay, so eliminate the corruption. It's not true. That is not, it is not true to say that if you actually eliminate corruption, the society is going to be wealthy. That will help, but it's not a sufficient reason but it's still one of the indicators. So I'm going to show you a couple of exemplars of this tradition. That is Douglass North, this Nobel laureate and the founder of institutional economics, or one of the founders of institutional economics. And more modernly, we have Darrell Acemoglu and James Robinson, who are at Harvard, at MIT. Darrell Acemoglu is at MIT. I think Robinson is at Harvard. And they wrote a very popular book called Why Nations Fail. Of course, before that, they published a number of articles preceding the book. The articles in magazines that were written in appropriate technical terms for serious economists. But then they published, luckily, Why Nations Fail for people like me, right? And so they can understand it for the general public. And basically, their thesis is that you have inclusive institutions and you have exclusive institutions. Inclusive institutions, this is an important concept, are those that allow society to function as a positive sum game. That is, as a web of interactions for mutual interest, and where all the actors gain, or almost all the actors gain. So that every sector of society captures gain from trade, right? So that is a basic notion in economics. They argue that these were developed in Britain, for example, and that's why the British colonies, they think, did better than the Spanish colonies. I come from Argentina. I have some anecdotal, but a lot of anecdotal evidence of that, where Spanish colonization did not carry the same good institutions, right? I have to warn you here, the word inclusive here has a different meaning to the one we're used to in political discourse today. It is used to signify institutions that include people of various ethnic backgrounds and religious backgrounds, people with different sexual preferences, and so forth. That's one meaning. I'm using a different meaning. The other meaning is inclusive institutions, whatever they are, laissez-faire or to some degree interventionist, whatever they are, they do not allow, rather, the powerful elites to capture the gains of trade all for themselves. Extractive are the opposite. Those where society is a zero-sum game, so there are only dominant elites capture the gains from trade. And so they think that this theoretical framework, this classification, is the most useful to explain why some nations have done more than others. Some of you may be very familiar to this. This is called the Great Enrichment or the Great Transformation. Some people call it the Great Transformation, Acemoglu and Robinson. And that is, as trade opens in the world, both internally and externally, and it's generalized, the level of poverty decreases enormously, just talking about poverty, not just about increasing prosperity and wealth. I'm talking about poverty alleviation, and this is very important for what is coming later. As I said, Deirdre McCloskey just published a book that we think is congenial to our thesis, although it's not. She had not. I wish we would have had the book when we published ours last year. But she has an exciting thesis. Says ideas, not institutions, cause the great enrichment. The main idea is that everyone is entitled to better themselves through trade and innovation. She calls it bourgeois equality, trade-tested betterment. So the idea is, in the old times, the aristocrats will tell the peasants, you stay in your place. You might go sell a little thing, but you cannot better yourself. You are born a miner in Wales, you remain a miner in Wales for the rest of your life. You're born a servant, you can never aspire to be a merchant. If you're a merchant, you never aspire to be member of the ruling class. In Britain, for example, I don't know if you told Downton Abbey, even 1912 shows that kind of thing, right? The servants are the servants, and the hero in there is the benign, benevolent aristocrat, who's the lord of the manor. And she says that everything changes when there is a transformation in the ethos of society, in the ethical fabric of society that allows the merchants to actually, who have no nobility, and perhaps even and no wealth to begin with, to better themselves through trade, to offer their labor or their productive ideas, start a business, and so forth. Bourgeois equality, she thinks, is the ideology of the merchant class, and she actually lashes out against Robinson and Acemoglu, says, property rights are not the thing. You think the property rights are the most important thing. I'm telling you the property rights existed in China in the 12th century or whatever. And so that cannot be. Well, I think that she exaggerates a little bit, although it's a very exciting book, a lot of fun to read, a lot of literary allusions and things like that. I think she exaggerates the product differentiation here. I think the differences between her and Acemoglu are exaggerated, because I don't think she would deny that property rights are a necessary condition for growth and prosperity. So we think it is congenial to our view, her views. A totally different view by the Rawlsian. One of the Rawlsians is a philosopher, now at Yale, Thomas Pogge, who argued for a long time that it doesn't matter how countries became rich or not, but I'm saying that they have established now, 2006, he wrote his book in 2002, have established an international system that keeps poor countries in poverty. So he has a little bit of a conspiracy theory that the international system is the one that keeps them in poverty. And that is an injustice, right? So, but he has to reject, in fact, Acemoglu and Robinson's view, because he has to have an imperialist explanation of why nations are in the situation they are. I think that, and he gives some reasons, some good arguments, that the present system has some injustices that we all know about. But I think Pogge gets his causal theory wrong, because this international system in the last 40, 50 years has done exactly the opposite of what he says. It has actually decreased poverty, helped decrease poverty immensely. So I think that even though he made some good points, we don't think that he's right. Then there's Jared Diamond. Jared Diamond wrote also a bestseller a number of years ago, won the Pulitzer Prize, Guns, Germs, and Steel, so Steel, Germs, and Guns. That's the thing, I don't know how wood was first. Where he's a geographer. Actually, he says that the reasons are not main institutions, but things, geographical factors, like malaria, tropical diseases, earthquakes, whatever. You live in the mountain instead of living in the plains, or being landlocked or not. And so he gives examples. My favorite, of course, is the one with Argentina. Argentina has horrible institutions. But I mean horrible, believe me. Take my word for it, right? I mean, I think they're worse than Argentina. But it's a country that does pretty well. I mean, they're wealthy. They're invited to the G20 every year. They sit there with Obama and Prime Minister of Britain, all that, among the rich and all this. How does that happen? A country that is so corrupt. And Jared Diamond says that's because Argentines have wonderful climate, he says. because we have temperate climate, quality of soil. Of course, we have the best beef in the world. I recommend it. That's because it grows in the pampas. That's the best soil in the world. We don't have any malaria diseases. He attributes to that. And I don't know. I have no idea if this is right or wrong on that. It's very interesting. But even he accepts that the answer is 50% institutions. So he's half an institutionalist as well. So these various, then after surveying these theories, then some reflections already made them about the authors that I mentioned. I'm going to add one more thing, the last point there. No leading development economist holds that growth is caused mainly by governmental interference with markets. Economists from the right, from the left, from the center, Jeffrey Sachs, you name them, Stiglitz, nobody would say, Krugman, they would not say that governments' interference with markets are the main cause of growth and alleviation of poverty. Such view, of course, is unsupported by the facts, but they take the view that when markets produce unjust outcomes, or the markets fail, there is market failure, the government, it is appropriate for the government to intervene. They would say that. But they would not say, I think, to my knowledge, that government interference with markets is the main cause of prosperity or poverty alleviation. So this just a short survey. What are the consequences for global justice? To go back to the beginning of this first segment of the presentation. Well, we have a nice slogan, leave people alone, right? I think the main position in global justice literature is what we call regulatory. They recognize that there's a lot of bad governance, they do recognize that, and they propose to substitute that bad governance for more governance, good one. The problem is not that there's too much state, there's too much government. The problem is that the governments are bad, they say. So what we need is more government, more coercion, more redistribution, more international bureaucracies. We need more committees, more United Nations, more regional organizations, more regulation, both national and global. And we dissent with that. We think that that is the result. We don't doubt, of course, their good faith in actually recommending this. We just think they have misdiagnosed the problem. If they paid any attention to the development literature, they could not hold that view, right? They should hold the view that what we need is freeing markets so that poor can participate in global markets as producers or consumers, as the experience shows, right? And not to have more regulation, more government, unless they recommend government that actually frees markets, that is less government, not more government. So we recommend then lifting the obstacles that many millions presently have in the form of local oppression, depredation, corruption, lack of rule of law, and bad institutions. That does not mean that the rich countries are free of blame. And they have a lot to answer for, especially in the area of immigration, as I try to tell you in a moment. So our recommendation of the book, liberalize trade and immigration, end tyranny and corruption whenever possible. Our book does not recommend invading anybody. It's not that recommends like the military action to get rid of tyrants, although I personally, although no my co-author believe that sometimes that is justified against many other people who doubt that, but the book does not engage that. And also privatize aid, take the foreign aid to the extent that is virtuous, is a moral virtue, to aid those who need it. Our position, which I will not discuss, is that the duty of aid is a moral duty and not a duty demanded by justice. There's a distinction between virtuous behavior and behavior that is mandated by justice. We believe that justice requires not interfering with the projects of others. Now, that is, of course, a slogan, right? So far, I have not given you an argument. So let me go for the argument here, right? All persons, in order to flourish, must be able to pursue personal projects. People are autonomous beings that pursue personal projects. Thus, global justice is based on the rule of non-interference, we claim, with the personal projects of others, close and distant. And so therefore, we think there's a philosophical foundation that dovetails with economic literature here, right? We think that one merit of our approach is that it dovetails with vast amounts of economic research, credible, reliable economic research. What consequence, other consequences this has, our view, for global justice? Some startling ones, and some of you may not like this, I don't know, or maybe you like it. Socialism is unjust. So our view is socialism understood by socialism, a system, a legal system that prevents markets to be robust, that the attempt to undermine the robustness of markets, right? Significantly, it's a question of degree, of course. Those are unjust. Why is that? Because they hamper markets and undermine property rights, and by doing that, it destroys the engines of growth and consequently the possibilities of poverty alleviation. I want to underscore this. Many people in the mainstream believe that, of course, if you believe in property rights, that you care about property rights. No, I said that I don't care about property rights per se. I care about alleviating poverty. On your own goals of alleviating poverty, you should support our position. So the global justice literature professes to be concerned with global poverty, but at the same time, they are agnostic toward economic systems. They say it's part of self-determination. If a nation wants to be socialist or capitalist, international law itself is totally neutral and agnostic toward different economic systems. Well, I think that that's a serious flaw of the international system. The international system should favor capitalism, should favor markets, and not the other system that destroy markets. I hasten to add, I don't want to hear, well, you can tell what you want, but anything named like Scandinavian, Denmark, Sweden, what about those? Those are thoroughly capitalist societies, right? So they are not socialist societies in my sense. My argument does not rule out, is agnostic indeed, about redistribution of wealth mandated by justice or by some national imperative or whatever that do not affect markets essentially, as it happens, I think, in the Scandinavian examples that people like to give. So I'm talking about socialism where the state is the owner of the means of production, or the state, what is called property-owning democracy, even though the market is allowed to function a bit, the state finally decides who produces what. That rules favor that, right? And I would add this. Most of the liberal critics, almost all of it, all the liberal criticism of socialism is on liberty grounds. Socialism is bad because in order to implement it, you require vast amounts of coercion, and that is very bad for liberty. That's this old criticism that's been given by every single classic liberal critic of socialism that we know. I accept that, of course, but I take a further step. Socialism is unjust under your own values. If your own values is to try to lift the poor out of poverty, you cannot be a socialist. You're mistaken. Maybe you're committing an economic mistake, but you are mistaken. All right, so what I'll try to do in the time that I have left is to talk a little bit about, I cannot talk about the two things I want to talk about, which is immigration and trade, so I'm going to talk about immigration. So we tackle in the book, in order, immigration first, then there's a chapter about the brain drain, which is a kind of a variation on the immigration argument that I will not talk about. Then trade, and then we talk about more conceptual philosophical issues like the legitimacy of states. We have a chapter on war and a chapter on aid. That's almost like the whole world, right? Well, I forgot climate change. We don't talk about climate change. But if we add climate change, it's the whole universe. So I cannot talk about all that. So let's talk about immigration a little bit, right? As I'm sure you know, both US law and international law allow nations, the state, to control their borders. Control borders, that is, exclude foreigners almost at pleasure. Not completely, not morally. For example, you cannot exclude immigrants based on race, for example. But apart from those exceptions, a state can close its own borders completely, and that would not violate international law. In our book, we defend what we call liberal or more liberal. Liberal, of course, you know, it doesn't mean Al Gore or anything like that. It means liberal in the philosophical sense, right? Liberal in the philosophical, not the political sense. So more liberal means more permissive, more generous immigration policies. So this is something that is present in the whole book, in every single topic. Immigration and trade are examples of that. And that is our position on immigration and on trade have two pillars, right? One is the philosophical justification of our classical liberal views on these things. And the other one is the consequential justification provided by the many empirical and theoretical economic studies on these issues. So let's start with, and of course, as you can imagine, I don't have zero economic originality. In economics, I rely on the research of others. But I have something to say on the philosophical part, which is the one that that is my area of expertise. So immigration barriers, what is the problem? I said that the norm of global justice should be one of non-interference with personal projects. People, in order to pursue your personal project, sometimes they want to move from A to B. They want to move from South Carolina to North Carolina. They want to move from Arizona to California. And also they want to move from Mexico to Arizona or California, right? So this they do in the normal course of things. They do this to seek opportunity, to better themselves and their families. True, there are people who have other purposes, perhaps. But most people who seek to move from A to B are pursuing a life project. It's part of the life project, right? Immigration barriers is an obstacle to the pursuit of personal life projects, right? So imagine if some folks from South Carolina wanted to move to North Carolina because they want to work in a kind of flourishing in the startups in North Carolina of some sort. And they move, they take the bus, or they take their cars, but alas, they find armed guards at the border that prevent them from going there. What would you think about that? It would be unthinkable, right? Then change the scene, and now you have people from Nogales, Mexico, wanted to move to Nogales, Arizona. I lived in Phoenix for 17 years, so I know the area very well. And I know that very well. And wanted to move people want to move because there are jobs in Arizona. They could not find jobs in depressed Sonora, north of Mexico. Now the thing's even much worse. It's completely decimated by the drug cartels. Not only now they have to suffer poverty, they have to dodge the bullets now there in the same area. So they want to move to Arizona. They want to start like a taco shop, or they want to work in the new industry, high-tech. Arizona has a number of high-tech, important high-tech businesses. Guess what? They meet armed guards at the border. How's that? All right? I believe that mere fact puts the burden of proof, or the burden, if you will, on those who defend immigration barriers. So have they met the burden? Well, if we talk about first the pursuit of personal projects, in addition, it's interference with freedom of association. I have my property in Tucson, Arizona, and I need workers in my property. I want to grow tomatoes. It's a bad idea to grow tomatoes in Arizona, but tomatoes, I want to grow tomatoes in Arizona, right? I don't know, what else you grow there? Cacti, I don't know, whatever you grow there. So grow tomatoes in Arizona, but I need workers. I don't know how to work the land. It's a big property. And I don't have workers, local workers, so or they are too expensive. And I invite people to establish this relationship with me, for me to become the employer, for them to be the workers that are going to work in my land, right? The armed guards show up again. So the armed guards are not only interfering with their pursuit of personal projects, they're interfering with my freedom of association. I am the owner of the property. Last time I heard, I get to decide who I admit or not admit to my property, right? That's what last time I heard, that's what property means. No, the armed guards, again, telling me I cannot admit whomever I want. So a staple of modern liberalism, in contrast to the Middle Ages, is then freedom of mobility. And also, I mentioned then South Carolina to North Carolina. If restrictions are desirable, why not enforce them within the United States? Maybe the South Carolinas coming to North Carolina also are doing something like getting jobs at the expense of North Carolina or something like that, the reasons that are given, that I think are flawed, but supposed to be the reason. Right? The bad things that immigration is supposed to do is going to do also internally, right? Economically at least. So people who defend immigration controls cannot explain international immigration control. The tools of economics, the tools of common sense cannot defend international immigration while supporting internal freedom of borders, open borders. Mobility restrictions based on nationality are morally arbitrary. The only reason why we say to the Mexican that he cannot come is because he's Mexican. That's arbitrary. And then there's more than that. We also always hear, which is I think is a kind of a good insight to say, some people have good luck and some people have bad luck. Philosophers talk about moral luck. What is moral luck? Someone is born into a wealthy family. Someone else is born in poverty. That's luck. You did not choose to be born in poverty. You did not choose to be born in wealth, right? And so therefore, some people are disadvantaged than others at the starting point. Well, if people born in Mexico are unlucky that were born there instead of wealthy United States, easing immigration will reduce moral luck, the fortuitous fact that someone is born in malfunctioning society. Amartya Sen, winner of the Nobel Prize 1998, was born, guess what? Bangladesh. That's the poorest country, one of the poorest countries in the world. He made his way one way or the other, was a genius, went to Oxford, I don't know where he went, then went to Cambridge, and then he went to Harvard, and became a Nobel Prize, like an incredibly talented economist, right? If we had really hard borders, right? The fact that we allowed Amartya Sen to come in is something that reduced the moral luck as far as we're concerned. I'm pretty sure that he would not have reached what he reached had he stayed in Bangladesh. This implies only, from my position, non-interference, not claims to positive assistance, right? So we are not arguing that people should come and receive assistance from the state or from others. Should come to seek opportunity. So my time is almost up. So let me mention only two objections that I think are important. One objection, there are more to our position. One objection is the welfare state system. We have a welfare state here. If we allowed more foreigners to come in, the pressure on the welfare system would be unbearable. Our hospitals will be completely crowded. Our schools will be crowded. If they're crowded as it is, to put more people, admit more people is unbearable. This is a serious problem. By the way, I would add that's an embarrassment for the mainstream because it is because of that they are forced to say like that they want immigration restrictions. But actually, this is something that we think it could be addressed. The best way to address it is get rid of the welfare system. That's not going to happen, so we're not putting that as main argument. But if you want to maintain the welfare system, some of it, or the big chunk of it, you might have some ways in which this can be done. You can require a bond for someone. I am an employer. An employee from Mexico feel free to come to work here, but you have to post a bond. You want to cross the border to start a taco shop, a taco joint, post a bond. Get someone to sponsor you or something, right? And that would actually might be the way to go. Or you can actually tell the immigrants that you can come, be my guest. You want to come here to work, you're welcome. But it's for 5 years you receive no benefits from the state, right? There are a number of ways to approach that. The other objection that I think is something that that everybody thinks about because of the events in Europe, for example, the Syrian refugees. We are less touched by this issue, but also affects us a little bit. That's the issue of security, right? So the idea is, if, for example, one of the presidential candidates today, the campaign has been saying, we don't know who's coming in. So we don't know who's coming in. We have to be careful because we're getting, taking criminals. All right, so my answer to that is, you don't know what's coming in. Make it your job to know who's coming in. So like Israelis do, for example. So our position is, and this is contrary to some other people who defend open or more open borders. My position is that the state, in spite of our position, the state has the power, rightful power to control for criminals and terrorists. The state can stop them at the border, notwithstanding the fact that we favor more open borders, more porous borders. I think that the idea is clear. The idea is this. The idea, what is the great liberal idea, classical liberal idea, is this. People who want to come to engage in positive sum interactions, to come to seek opportunity for themselves and their families, to try to grow and become somebody, and then go to college, the children and all that, those people are more than welcome. Those people come, just to use one word, to trade what they have, the labor for pay, right? To engage in positive, mutually beneficial interactions. There are other people who don't want to trade. They want to prey on others. So want to kill, rape, and maim others. So the principle that we suggest is that the state can stop those people. But those people are not favored by the, I don't think, by the liberal conception of immigration as a facilitating or trade and mutual beneficial, positive social interactions. The problem is the implementation. How do you do it? I don't know. Some countries do it well, like Israel, and others do it well. And this is a technological issue that I don't think is unsolvable. I don't know because I don't know. The reason I say I don't know because I don't know the technology, right? But I don't think it's impossible for a country to do a better job, if not a perfect job, in keeping out criminals, right? So the idea is, you are what is called an economic refugee. Some who come from economic reasons. Those are very good people. We want those people. These people are going to make us wealthier. And we actually are doing a good service to them also by providing opportunity. There's much more to be said about this, but I think my time is up, and I want to stop and allow for questions. So thank you very much for your attention.
So I have a question about, you had a list of freedoms that were important, economic freedoms, political freedoms,
yes,
and institutions that are good for crafting a prosperous society.
Right.
So one of them on there was low corruption, which obviously seems important.
Yes.
There's a question that's come up in economics quite frequently about how countries move from bad institutions to good institutions. So how do you get rid of corruption? And is that necessary or sufficient?
Low corruption is a very important contributor to prosperity and therefore poverty alleviation, I think, for obvious reasons. That's, I think, is answering the last part of your question. The first part of your question is, I only can say, is an extremely difficult issue. There are international organizations that are Transparency International, many others. The World Bank has worked, the IMF has been working on solutions to eliminate corruption, and by providing incentives to governments like loans and things like that if they observe certain transparency rules. So there are lots of proposals out there. The reason I say that is very difficult is that corrupt regimes are able to portray their corrupt behavior as something that is in the common good, right? So therefore, since the public does not understand economics, the public votes them into office because they think they are getting some short-term benefits. And in the medium and long-term term, the society is declining. That's happening in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, for example, very typical, right? The populist rulers, the corrupt populist rulers, take position, the corrupt measures to enrich themselves, that's the corruption, that help them in the short term to win elections, when there are elections, right? But in the long term, ruin the country. So I don't know how that can be solved. The only way, the thing I can think of is incentives, provide incentives to democratically elected leaders that they're going to do better. If they behave like New Zealand, they're going to do better in the international arena. Their people are going to do better, and they're going to be elected if they behave in a more transparent way. So through incentives, like everything else, I think. But in case of dictatorships, that is much harder because people are not elected. So that I think you need to solve, that needs to be solved by the people themselves. There's no solution. I think that invading them and removing them is not a good idea just because they're corrupt, right? So the costs are prohibitive. Yes, sir.
Would you like to comment on your home country and the new government there and the prospects for those institutions in Argentina to find their way?
Well, a number of us are actually mildly optimistic about the new government because the previous government was incredibly corrupt. This is a very interesting case because the government, the private Kirchner regime, was a government that was democratically elected with 54%. And moreover, with a few exceptions, it was like quite respectful of civil and political liberties. Not totally, because it had some problems with the press, but it was on the international scale that Freedom House would give it a high rating. And yet, the government was a disaster because it was what I call a kleptocracy. That's a government that's really a variation on my previous answer. Governments that engineer the process so that they, with the only purpose of increasing, or the main purpose of increasing their own power and influence. In order to do that, they might do liberalize today, regulate tomorrow, a lot of things, but if need be, they would steal directly. Like the Kirchner regime overnight expropriated all the private retirements in the nation. All of them. People have saved all their lives. And they say, why is that? Because everybody should have a pension. Retirement. Why were only the rich that saved? Look at that argument. The fact that argument has some traction will really worry us about the state of knowledge of the population, of the voters. Now, the new government seems better. I know that Macri is someone who is sympathetic to some of the views that I espouse and all that, but he has very serious kind of contextual obstacles to actually do what he wants. He cannot actually, with the labor unions, it's almost impossible to do any kind of flexibility in labor legislation. They actually has improved on the question of, which is very important, on attracting foreign investment, has done things like solving the problem of the defaults, various defaults that we had, to the satisfaction of the creditors, I think. But I don't know. We'll wait and see. We would do well in soccer. That's very good. Also, my wine, the Malbec wine is doing very well. Malbec, red wine.
Thank you for your talk. One of the things that you said that struck me was you said that aid is a virtuous behavior. It's not something that should be demanded by justice.
Right.
I wonder if that is an overly idealistic view. So should people give of their own accord? Yes. But they don't. And if they don't, and there are people in need, then wouldn't that be an argument justifying a more intrusive or perhaps a redistributive?
Yeah, I have a whole
apparatus?
chapter on foreign aid that I didn't have the time to develop, but so let me answer your question. And it's a very good question. In order to answer that, I need to refer to the fundamentals which I did not discuss at length, the philosophical fundamentals. Justice is about respecting the rights of others. That includes respecting the property of others, right? In our view. Morality is much broader than justice, right? So for example, let me give you an example. I think that somebody who is a cheat and a liar is a bad person, is an unvirtuous person, I believe. But I don't think the law should do anything about him. I don't think cheats and liars should go to jail, for example. to give you an example. So it's a kind of a morally wrong behavior. So justice does not exhaust morality. So our position is, for the reasons we argue in the book, that have to do with personal value, impersonal value, that, that justice requires non-interference with the personal projects of others. It does not require actively aiding in the personal projects of others. Morality may require more than that, may require the moral obligation to give to those who need it, right? But that is separate from the role of the state. So for example, just as somebody who cheats on his spouse should not go to jail for that reason, it's kind of immoral behavior, so somebody who fails to give to the needy should not be forced by the state to give to the needy, we think, right? It remains a matter of personal behavior. That was called virtues, referring to theories of virtue, you know. That's what, in that sense, I was using the word virtues. So in other words, personal morality is not coextensive with political morality. So some behavior is both more immoral and also violates precepts of justice. Murder, for example, it both violates the rights of others, and for that reason, the state is justified in punishing the criminal, the murderer, right? But the cheat and the liar is an immoral person that we think the state should not. Another example is prostitution. I think prostitution is very bad. If somebody, my daughter comes and says, "Hey, I'm thinking, should be a lawyer or a prostitute?" I say, well, I don't think that's a very good career choice. You know, for A, B, and C, and D, you should not do that. But I also believe, at the same time, that the state should not criminalize prostitution, right? A lot of people fail to distinguish between those two things. What is wrong as a matter of morality and what is actionable as a matter of justice. Those two things ought to be distinguished. Yeah.
You stated that McCloskey has the view that it's the right of the individual to better themselves through innovation and trade, but also at the same time that institutions are necessary but not completely enough for something like government to take full action.
Yeah.
What do you view the role of an institution as?
Well, okay, so let's rewind a little bit. Institutions, like my colleagues here, our economists, can tell us, the important institutions have to do with incentives. Institutions create incentives, the right incentives. So you need the right institutions because they create the right incentives for wealth creation, and you need wealth creation to fight poverty, right? So therefore, if you care about alleviation of poverty, you need to have institutions that actually incentivize people to produce, right? Okay. So I think McCloskey will agree with that. But she adds to that that's not enough. What you need is also societal support of that in terms of people believing, all of us admire, she uses the word admiration, admiring the merchant, for example. We need to admire the merchant. The merchant, oh, look at Steve Jobs or whatever, the creator of Apple or Warren Buffett, or these people. And so she thinks that institutions are not enough. Like private property created incentives for the little farmer, but the little farmer could not prosper very much because of the class barriers were so rigid. Yeah. So to answer your question, the role of institutions is simply to create the right incentives for the productive behavior of people, in my view. In this context, some other people have some richer theory of institutions that involve other things, but in the context of global justice, that's what it is, I think. And that applies to international institutions as well.
All right, you said one of your objections was security, and that one way to address this issue was by making it government's duty to allow those with good, positive intentions into a country and to keep those with bad intentions out. How could a government do that, and would that make them add more of those armed guards that you talked about earlier?
Yeah, well, as I said, how could the government do that? I don't know. I am not a policymaker, luckily, and I don't want to be one. I don't know, I'm not somebody who is actually sitting there rolling up his sleeves and thinking about the concrete solutions to problems. Because I'm pretty incompetent for that. I'm not good at that. I am a little bit better at thinking about the principle issues, right? The issues of principle. So here I want to say, the principle is clear. The principle is that a nation with the borders that it has we think, should, in principle, soften borders for the reasons I gave. And that would be the default rule. Now, the exception to that softening of borders would be, but we will not allow you to go there to maim and kill people and steal from people, right? How to do that is a technological problem that I don't know, but I do not believe, two things I believe. I believe that it is possible technologically. I don't think it's an impossible. It doesn't sound to me like, something that traveling to Jupiter or something. It seems to me that it's something that is possible. And some governments do it better than others today. The other thing I want to say, at the very least, is in present jurisdiction, present states, the borders are harder than they should be for the purpose of security. They are less permissive than they should be, accounting even for issues of security. Why? Because they have all these false theories that, for example, immigrants steal jobs from the natives, and that immigrants, for example, had something, this I didn't talk about, that is false. It's false economically, it's demonstrably false. Immigrants, for example, pollute the local culture. That, I think, is a bad argument. Nobody really thinks that they would be better off without Chinese food, right? So I think it's an argument that the border is not ridiculous. I think the one on cultural pollution or cultural something like that. So the state has all these bad reasons, not just security. It has all these bad reasons for stopping immigrants, right? So as a result of that, the borders are harder, right? Are more, harder than they should be if the only concern was, or the main concern was security. Yes?
So on the topic of exclusive institutions, you would say that they're bad and that in your terms of justice, you should get rid of them. So what are some real-world examples of these exclusive institutions, and how would you practically get rid of them?
Excellent question. Exclusive institutions range I refer you to the book, Why Nations Fail. They have a host of things there. But let me just give you a garden variety thing. They range from very extremes. Like, for example, Saddam Hussein accumulating all the wealth of Saddam Hussein's, of oil in Iraq, right? And excluding the people where the only concern of Saddam Hussein was remaining in power. So that was the only thing he cared about, and did it very well for many years until 2003. And therefore, that is the definition of an extremely exclusive institution, right? The institution is, we produce to increase the wealth of the ruler, right? That's an extreme example. But it's a question of degree. You go down, right? And for example, a number of communist countries during the Cold War that actually had differential levels of income determined by law, whether or not you were a member of the Communist Party or not, for example. It's more complicated than that. But certainly, the laws did not actually sanction a kind of a mutually beneficial, it was a whole zero-sum kind of social interaction. In Latin America, where I come from, originally, because of the bad economic theories that the Spaniards had, right? The theory is called mercantilism. The idea that you need to mercantilism means that you need to accumulate wealth, and if you cannot accumulate it by trade, you just prey. You go exploit the resources from whoever has it. You steal from other countries, right? So the Spaniards had that view, for example. And unfortunately, so many Latin American societies continue in those kinds of traditions where the institutions did not allow enough for private entrepreneurship. Did not allow enough for people to better themselves, right? Through trade, right? It was still a system of privilege where the government, maybe if it was democratic even, and a number of elites were the ones that capture most of the gains for trade. Not all of them, because in order for the exclusive institutions to subsist, you cannot allow the victims of that to perish. So you have to actually give them something, right? Otherwise, you cannot continue exploiting them.
Tesón, I'll take the luxury of it then.
Oh, please.
You talked about international organizations creating more government as a check on government. The United Nations seems to me to be a pretty good example of that. But it's an extraordinary taboo to say the United Nations is doing anything wrong.
Oh, I think it's horrible.
So,
And I'm an international law professor. I'm not supposed to say that.
so how can people who are not powerful international law professors begin to support this idea that there's a different way to do international justice?
I have no idea. All I can say is to tell you what I think. But let me say, do I have a reflection on international organizations, what you said? And I think your question brings out an important difference that must be made. It is not correct to say that every international organization, or actually it leads to exclusive institutions and do not actually contribute to the creation of wealth. That would be false. The WTO, it would be better if it didn't exist, if everything was free exchange of goods for everybody, but compared to what we had before, the WTO is decent in actually gradually lowering the barriers to trade, but gradually, it's the second best solution, right? Think about, for example, the effort also in a different area, the efforts of the United Nations. The United Nations, which is, I think it's a corrupt, immoral organization, most of it, but not all of it. For example, some of the specialized agencies have done a phenomenal job in eradicating diseases from Africa. Because they actually, what they did is they actually reduced the transaction costs of actually doing this internationally. They reduced the information cost as part of the transaction cost, right? And they centralized lots of stuff where an emergency like a AIDS epidemic in Africa, you need coordination. And in that sense, when it's not politicized, when it's actually, it does not touch on the privilege of the bad rulers, right? The United Nations is not that bad. But the problem that we all have is that in all the political issues, and also those that are not even economic issues or other kinds of issues, where the United Nations actions threatened the interest of rulers, all rulers, but especially bad rulers, then we get what we get, which is pretty bad, right? That's why does many bad things. The Human Rights Council is a shame. Actually, the people that sit in the council are people who torture. These are the people who are judging others on human rights. And I could give many, many, many examples. I think the World Bank, which is associated with the United Nations, is doing a credible job in helping, gather information, do things to fight poverty. I don't know, someone closer to that can say. If you take the International Maritime Organization, those kinds of non-politicized agencies can do a decent job, again, in coordinating the activities of many people in the globe. So I was speaking a little bit like generalizing a little bit unfairly. I have my problem, and I've said that in writing with the United Nations, is the problem that I just mentioned, which is it overprotects rulers. And it is an organization whose job is to protect incumbency, whoever it is that is but because they're interested in stability, right? But if you're interested in global justice, stability cannot be your only value.
Professor Tesón, thank you so much for being
here. Oh, thank you very much. My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks.